Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me? All right, great. As Laura said, I'm Ishil Dilig. I'm a professor from UT Austin, and I'm here to tell you about our work on synthesizing fine-grained synchronization protocols for implicit monitors. And before I start, I do want to highlight that most of the credit for this work goes to my PhD students, Kostas Ferlis and Benjamin Sapensky. Unfortunately, they were not able to make it to New Zealand. And also, this is also joint work with Rahul Krishnan, who's here, and he was an undergraduate in my group at the time, as well as my colleague James Bornholt, also from UT Austin. Okay, so first of all, as you can tell from the title of the talk, this talk concerns a programming abstraction called a monitor. And in a nutshell, a monitor is basically a class that is used to mediate access to shared resources in concurrent programming. And at a high level, you can think of a monitor as a class that encapsulates all memory that's shared between threads, and it also provides methods that provide access to shared data. So you basically call monitor methods to both read from and write to data that's shared between threads. And assuming that clients of the monitor use it correctly, it should be implemented in such a way that it will guarantee deadlock as well as data race freedom. And furthermore, it should also guarantee atomicity. And by that, I mean that all monitor operations, or in other words, all monitor methods, should appear to take place atomically as one indivisible unit. Now, generally speaking, we can classify monitors as either being implicit or explicit, depending on which concurrency primitives are used in their implementation. Now, among these two, the explicit monitors are the more standard one. That's probably the one that you're familiar with. And specifically, an explicit monitor is implemented using the familiar concurrency primitives like locks and condition variables. And typically, you use locks to ensure mutual exclusion, and we use condition variables to block when some shared resource is not available, and you use condition variables to signal when some shared resource does become available. Now, implicit monitors, on the other hand, are a more declarative programming abstraction, and they're implemented using a higher level concurrency primitive called a conditional critical region, abbreviated as a CCR, that goes all the way back to Tony Hoare. And basically, a CCR is a statement of the form wait until some condition C, then do S. And the semantics of such a statement is that you should block if C is false. And when C does become true, all threads blocked on C should get woken up and they should atomically execute the statement S. Now, a very important thing to note here is that note that there is no explicit locking or signaling. It is the responsibility of the underlying system to make sure that threads get woken up when C becomes true. And again, it's also the responsibility of the underlying programming system to make sure that S executes atomically. There is no need for explicit locking here. Now, as you can imagine, when you compare explicit and implicit monitors, we have the familiar trade-off between efficiency and programmability. And as you can see here, by comparing the two explicit and implicit implementations of the same monitor, the implicit monitor looks a lot more concise, right? It's much easier to reason about, and in general, everyone would agree that it is much easier to implement it in a way that is correct, that guarantees deadlock freedom, data race freedom, and atomicity. On the other hand, implicit monitors typically require some runtime support, whereas explicit monitors give more fine-grained control to the programmer. So as a result, they can be much more efficient than their implicit monitor counterparts. Now, our goal in this work is to sort of bridge this trade-off between efficiency and programmability by taking a synthesis-based approach. So in particular, our goal is to take an implicit monitor as a specification, and we want to automatically synthesize an explicit monitor in a way that is both correct by construction and also in a way that is as efficient as possible, with the goal of providing the best of both worlds in terms of efficiency as well as programmability. Now, generally speaking, if you want to synthesize the explicit implementation from the implicit version, we need to do two things. So the first challenge we need to solve is we need to synthesize a signaling protocol. By that, I mean we need to figure out what condition variables to introduce, and we need to figure out where to signal and how to do this signaling. But the second challenge is also to synthesize a locking protocol, and by that I mean we need to figure out which locks are needed, and we need to figure out where to insert lock acquisition and release operations. Now, it turns out that among these two challenges, we actually do have a prior work. It's a tool called Espresso that was presented in PLDI 2018. That handles one piece of the puzzle. So in particular, it does synthesize the signaling protocol, and it does locking in a very coarse-grained way. And by that, what I mean is that it uses a single global lock to ensure correctness. It basically, there's one lock that's associated with the entire monitor, and you acquire that lock before each monitor operation, and you release that lock at the end. But it actually turns out, as you can imagine, that having a single global lock that is having a coarse-grained locking scheme can be suboptimal in many cases, as I will illustrate shortly. And the focus of this work is to address the second piece of the puzzle, namely, how do we automatically synthesize an efficient, fine-grained locking protocol? Now, before I continue, I want to give you a concrete example that illustrates why having a single global lock can be inefficient. So on this slide, we see an implicit monitor that implements basically a blocking FIFO queue. And as you can see here, it provides two operations. One is a put operation. And as you might expect, this is supposed to add an element to the queue. And of course, you're supposed to block if the queue is full. And we also have an operation called take, which is supposed to remove an element from the queue. And of course, it's supposed to block if the queue is empty. Now, the important thing to note here is that these two operations, put and take, should be able to run concurrently most of the time, except in a few edge cases. Those edge cases being when either the queue is completely full or when it's completely empty, because in the other cases, the put and take operations are going to be accessing different pieces of memory. However, if you were to go ahead and use a single global lock for the entire monitor implementation, we would be preventing threads from executing put and take concurrently, and as a result, we would be missing out on valuable parallelization opportunities in this example. And in fact, if you look at the explicit monitor implementation, this is the optimal version, you see that it actually uses two locks. So there is one called put lock that is associated with the put method. And there is a separate lock called take lock, which is acquired before take and released after executing the take operation. And additionally, note that there is a potential data race here. So in particular, both put and take methods access a variable called count. So in order to prevent a data race on that variable, this implementation basically implements count as an atomic integer, and we use operations like get and increment and get and decrement instead of using the familiar plus and minus. And if you actually stare at this for a second and think about what's going on here, you will realize that this implementation is indeed correct. There are no data races or deadlocks. And furthermore, all the monitor operations appear from an outsider's perspective to take place atomically. And furthermore, this implementation turns out to be optimal in the sense that we maximize parallelism. So the key takeaway lesson from this example is we would like to synthesize a locking scheme that both maximizes parallelization opportunities while at the same time ensuring correctness. And we have three key correctness criteria, namely data race and deadlock freedom, as well as atomicity. So how do we do that? So in this work, we take the following high-level approach. So as a first step, we perform static analysis with the goal of identifying all possible parallelization opportunities between threads. Then, in the second step, we're going to use the results of the static analysis to generate a maximum satisfiability problem. And we're going to do this in such a way that the solution to this MaxSAT instance is going to correspond to an optimal locking protocol. And in the last step, we're going to use the result of the MaxSAT encoding to instrument the code with locking operations as needed. So overall, this is what our synthesis framework looks like. So given an implicit monitor implementation, the first thing we do is we leverage our prior work from PLDI 2018 to synthesize a signaling protocol. Then after we do that, this is where the contribution of this OOPSLA paper comes into play. So we basically first perform static analysis, use it to do MaxSAT encoding, and then use it to do instrumentation. And in the remainder of this talk, I'm going to explain each of these pieces in just a little bit more detail. So let's start with the first piece, which is the static analysis part. So at a high level, the goal of our static analysis is twofold. So first, we would like to identify potential data races, because obviously if two code snippets S and S prime are racy, we want to make sure that they cannot execute in parallel. Second, we also would like to identify all possible safe interleaving opportunities between threads. And as you will see shortly, this is important for ensuring that monitor operations appear to take place atomically from an outsider's perspective. So among these two problems, the identification of potential data races, there is a lot of work on this topic. This is a fairly well understood problem in the literature. So I'm not going to focus on the detection of data races piece. But the main novel, and in my opinion, the more challenging part of the problem is how we identify safe interleaving opportunities. So that's what I'm going to focus on in the context of our static analysis. So first, what do I even mean by a safe interleaving? So we say that a code snippet S can be safely interleaved in between two consecutive code fragments, S1 and S2, if executing S in between S1 and S2 results in a program state that is equivalent to one where you execute S1 and S2 actually consecutively. So in other words, you can think of it as if an interleaving is safe, the resulting state is going to be an equivalent to an execution where monitor methods actually execute atomically. And as it turns out, this is really the key piece of getting good performance, of being able to synthesize a good fine-grained looking protocol, as we illustrate in our experimental evaluation in the paper. So how do we detect these safe interleavings? So our method for detecting safe interleavings relies on the following theorem, which we prove in the paper. So this theorem says that a code snippet S can be interleaved in between two consecutive code fragments S1 and S2 if S left commutes with S1 as well as all the predecessors of S1, and also S should right commute with S2 as well as all the successors of S2. And the notion of commutativity is fairly standard, but to refresh everyone's memory, we say that a code snippet X left commutes with Y if whenever X executes right after Y, this state is the same as when X executes right before Y. And the definition of right commutativity is similar, except that you flip the words before and after. So let's take a look at an example. So say we have a monitor method containing these two code snippets, S1 and S2, and as you can see, they're consecutive in the sense that there is a control flow edge immediately from S1 to S2. Now, to determine whether some other code snippet S can be interleaved in between S1 and S2, we're going to perform the following commutativity checks. So first, we're going to check whether S left commutes with S1. And because A is a predecessor of S1, we're also going to check whether it left commutes with A. And in addition, we're also going to do our right commutativity check. So we're going to test whether S right commutes with S2. And because C is a successor, we're also going to check whether S right commutes with C or not. And if they do, if all of these program equivalences hold, then that means S can be interleaved between S1 and S2. And how do we perform these commutativity checks? Well, as you can see from this example, performing this commutativity check essentially boils down to proving equivalence between a pair of code snippets. So essentially, this boils down to proving a relational Hoare triple. Okay, so that's what I wanted to tell you about the static analysis. So now next, let's see how we can use the results of the static analysis to do our MaxSAT encoding. So recall here that our goal is to find a locking scheme that maximizes parallelization opportunities while obeying our correctness requirements. And it's very natural to formulate this constraint optimization problem as an instance of maximum satisfiability, where you have a set of hard constraints that you absolutely have to satisfy. And additionally, you have a set of soft constraints that we would like to satisfy, but we don't necessarily have to satisfy. It's just a preference. And in this context, the hard constraints correspond to our correctness requirements, whereas the soft constraints are going to correspond to our performance objective, that is maximizing parallelization opportunities. Okay, so first, to do the MaxSAT encoding, we need to introduce some Boolean variables. And as you can expect, in this context, we're going to introduce a Boolean variable to represent which locks are going to be held by which code snippets. So in more detail, we're going to introduce variables of the form HSL, such that if such a variable is assigned to true, that means code snippet S needs to hold block L. And if this variable is assigned to false, then that means before we execute S, we don't need to hold block L. So now we're going to generate a formula over these propositional variables. And based on the truth assignment to these variables, we can determine the lock set associated with each code snippet. That is the set of locks that must be held when we execute that code snippet. And I'm going to denote this using this notation. L of S just means the lock set associated with S. And this is the set of Boolean variables, HSL, for which that are assigned to true for S. Okay, so now we introduced our Boolean variables. Next, let's talk about our hard constraints. So as I mentioned earlier, our hard constraints are going to correspond to our correctness requirements. And we're going to have one class of hard constraints for each of our requirements, namely data race freedom, atomicity, and deadlock freedom. So first, for data race freedom, we're going to introduce a constraint that says we're going to resolve data races by introducing locks. So specifically, we look at the results of our static analysis. If the analysis tells us that S1 and S2 are potentially racy, then we're going to introduce a constraint that says S1 and S2 must hold at least one common lock. And on this slide, I expressed it in terms of the lock sets, but observe that this is just shorthand. You can easily translate it to a propositional formula, a more complicated propositional formula over the Boolean variables I introduced on the previous slide. So next, we're going to introduce another class of hard constraints to encode atomicity, or in other words, to preserve the illusion of atomicity. And in order to do so, we're going to say that we only want to permit safe interleavings. And again, we consult the results of our static analysis. And if our analysis says S cannot safely be interleaved in between S1 and S2, then we need to ensure that all three code snippets, S1, and S2, must hold a common lock. And again, I wrote this in terms of these lock sets, but you can translate it to a propositional formula. And for deadlock freedom, we're going to play the standard trick of imposing a static order on the way we acquire the locks. And specifically, for deadlock freedom, we're going to say that if there is a control flow edge from code snippet S1 to S2, and if L1 is a lock that's required by both S1 and S2, whereas L2 is one that's only needed by S2 but not by S1, we're going to impose a constraint that says L1 must come before L2 in our lock acquisition order. So those are the hard constraints. Now let's turn to the soft constraints that we use to encode our performance objective. So obviously, one of our performance objective, as I alluded to earlier, is maximizing the number of code snippets that can run in parallel. But at the same time, there is a cost associated with each locking operation. Every time you acquire and release a lock, that's not free. So in order to make sure that we don't introduce any redundant locks, we also want to minimize the number of locks that we introduce. So based on this, we're going to have two classes of soft constraints, one that's used to maximize parallelism and another for minimizing the number of locks. For maximizing parallelism, we're going to say that if two code snippets S1 and S2 are not racy, then we prefer an assignment where they don't hold the same lock. And for minimizing the number of locks, for every specific lock L, we're going to say that we prefer that lock not being used, so we introduce this big conjunction over all of our code fragments. Okay, so finally, let's see how we use the results of the MaxSAT encoding to do the instrumentation. So what we're going to do is basically ask the MaxSAT solver for an assignment, and we're going to use that assignment to insert locking operations along control flow edges. So specifically, if there is a control flow edge from S1 to S2, we're going to look at the assignment returned by our MaxSAT solver, and we're going to release all the locks that are needed by S1 but not by S2, and then subsequently, we're going to acquire all the locks that are needed by S2 but not by S1, and of course we're going to do this in the order that's dictated by our static lock acquisition order that I talked about earlier. Okay, so that's all the technical detail. Let me also tell you a little bit about our implementation. So we evaluated our tool, which by the way is called Cortado because it's the successor of our previous one, Espresso. And we evaluated it on monitors that are taken from widely used Java projects that do contain parallelization opportunities. And then we compared the performance of the Cortado synthesized code against two baselines. The first one is the manual explicit monitor implementation that we found in the Java project. And we also compared it against the version that's generated by our prior work, Espresso, and recall that it does optimal signaling, but for the locking, it does coarse-grained locking. It just uses a single global lock for the entire monitor. So here on this slide, we're looking at the results for one specific example, namely the one that we saw earlier. So here the x-axis is the number of threads, and the y-axis is the milliseconds per monitor operation. So obviously, the smaller this number, the better the performance. The blue line corresponds to the performance of our tool Cortado. The green line is our prior work Espresso, and the red line is the manual implementation that we found in the original Java project. And as you can see on this slide, the Cortado synthesized code outperforms both our prior work as well as the manually written explicit implementation. And we evaluated it on a bunch of other projects. And if you look at the other benchmarks, the results, I could only fit this many on the slide, but the results look pretty similar. Overall, we see that, in many cases, the Cortado synthesized code has significantly better performance than both Espresso as well as the manually written explicit implementation in most cases. So to summarize, basically we presented a synthesis framework for generating fine-grained synchronization protocols, and there are two key ideas. So first, we perform static analysis to identify data races and safe interleaving opportunities, and then we generate an MaxSAT encoding whose solution corresponds to an optimal locking scheme. So thank you for listening. I'm happy to take any questions.
Hi, thank you for the talk. So for your awake blocking queue implementation, what does your synthesize version do, and how is it different from the original version? Like it shows speed up, so I'm just curious what it does.
So basically, the implementation that we synthesize is exactly what I showed you earlier. So let me go back. So it basically introduces two locks, and it also introduces it basically implements the count variable as an atomic integer. So I didn't talk about it in this talk because it seemed like too much detail. But in addition to introducing locks, our technique also has the capability to decide which variables should be implemented using atomic types. Yeah.
And the baseline is one single lock.
Exactly. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I'd like to ask two questions. First of all, going back to that question just now about the queue. You said that queue was maximally efficient in terms of parallelization. How do you justify that claim?
Okay, so I don't have a proof off the top of my head that it maximizes parallelism, but at least let me say that this is certainly maximizes parallelism compared to the version that does global locking.
Okay. At a quick look, my guess is that it is not as good as the Maitland-Scott two-lock queue, which increases parallelism in that situation by using a header node and thereby reducing contention, even in the case where you...
By using a what did you say?
Node in the queue.
Sorry, what did you say? By using what?
A header node.
Oh yeah, so...
By the data structure, adding an extra node.
Oh, you're absolutely right, but here in this work, we're not concerned with changing the implementation of the data structure. So all we're doing is basically inserting locking operations and signaling operations. So we're not...
So you claim that maximal parallelization...
Under that assumption, under the assumption that...
you're not changing that.
Right, exactly, yeah.
My second question is, have you looked at or thought about synthesizing protocols for lock-free data structures?
We have not considered that at all in this work, but that's definitely like something that's very interesting. There's a little bit of work on that.
It certainly is.
Yeah,
very challenging.
Yeah.
Actually, sorry, I would like to ask just one more. What is the most complicated data structure you've looked at? I'm particularly interested to know whether you've looked at more complicated data structures like trees or any sort.
I don't know what, like which one is more complicated is a bit, in the eyes of the beholder. But if you look at the paper, like you can basically, in the appendix of the paper, we do provide all the synthesized implementations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. I was wondering if you considered adding, if your system would change if you actually had specifications on the methods that would weaken the strong constraints that you have on identity. So the particular example I'm thinking about is I add a print statement somewhere in my method, and all of a sudden your atmosphere requirements are going to prevent you from doing anything. But if your specification sort of allows you to sort of ignore that, then you might be able to get extra concurrency.
Yeah, that's a very good idea. That's a very good question. So with additional human annotations, we could certainly weaken that, but without knowing what you care about, in this work, we didn't weaken the specification.
So none of your benchmarks actually has asserts or requires type statements in the method?
I believe so. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. So maybe I'm missing something, but intuitively it makes sense to have the I want to minimize the number of blocks. But what if you didn't?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Intuitively, it makes sense to say I want to minimize the number of blocks.
Yeah.
But what if you didn't do that?
If you didn't do that, so basically what we do is we consider a maximum number of, like, we first compute the lower bound on the maximum number of blocks, and if you say I want to maximize parallelization opportunities, but you don't have that additional constraint, then it will assign additional variables to true, and then you're going to end up like, you know, even though you don't need it, you're going to introduce like locking and release operations for no reason. So, yeah.
Okay, we can release the lock on the speaker, so you know a bunch, but thank you.
Thank you.